back. Welcome, students of the University of Washington. Welcome, people of the universe at large. This is The Pivot. My name's Sam Kenyon. Sitting next to me is Chris McBride.
Hello.
And this is the podcast where we talk about a mixture of NBA happenings and political happenings as well. Let's move right into the first quarter. So, obviously, we're smack dab in the middle of the playoffs. The best time to be a basketball fan. We're in the second round now, and things have heated up. Earlier on, it was looking like maybe the first round was going to be a little bit of a letdown, but that turned out not to be the case. A lot of fantastic close finishes and a few upsets. The first game I want to talk about, the first series I want to talk about is the Bulls Heat, Miami Heat, Chicago Bulls. Now, first off, we should get this out of the way. I'm a tremendous Miami Heat fan. They're my team. It's who I root for. That's who I like.
Walks around campus wearing a Miami Heat hat
as often as possible.
Hoodie.
Yeah.
People make fun of him.
No. They love it. They're jealous, but that's okay. I don't blame them. So, game one, total surprise. The Bulls come out and they win. I think Miami was certainly favored to win, and not only were the Bulls an upset as they were, as they're a regularly constructed team, but they had to deal with a number of kind of crazy injuries. Not only Derrick Rose, obviously he's been gone for a long time, but Luol Deng, a severe flu, Kurt Heinrich is out, and they were still able to pull it out. Just shocking, tremendous. I think a huge component, obviously, Nate Robinson.
University of Washington alumni.
Right. That's right.
It's fantastic.
Feels really good. The little man took it to the Heat late in the game, and they had no answer for him, and I mean none.
You know what the greatest part about Nate Robinson is? I met him once, just at a fleeting party when I was living up here, and I'm 5'6". He's listed at 5'9". There's no way in hell that guy is 5'9". He's 5'6.5", 5'7" max. It's wonderful.
And he had the great quote afterwards. He said, "God bless me with all heart and no height." And I'll take that every time. Bill Simmons talks about irrational confidence, guys. And I think that's a tremendous label for a guy like Nate Robinson, a guy who, it doesn't matter if he's missed the last 20 shots. If he's open, he's taking it. And it's that confidence that gives him his swagger and game.
NPR had a pretty fantastic poll. They were polling who was the number one person that you would want to shoot the ball through number 5. And the number 1 was Kevin Durant with the game on the line. Number 3 was LeBron. Number 2 was Steph Curry, which is funny to see how much his star has risen lately. Mm-hmm. But Nate Robinson was number 5, and they joked that they'd have all 4 of those guys on the court, and of course it'd be Nate Robinson taking the last shot because no one else would get a chance.
That's exactly right. That's the exact kind of player he is, and what I loved about his game against Miami is he didn't just do it with long bomb threes. He did it by cutting into the middle. One play in particular, late in the game, he sliced right down the lane, and Miami's defense, which is normally pretty strong, could not collapse in time to stop the little Nate Rob from putting in a relatively easy layup. And it reminded me, as a Heat fan, it sent tremors of flashbacks of 2010. J.J. Barea,
yeah,
from the Mavericks, just cutting up the Miami defense. And you think to yourself, how is this happening? These guys are tremendous defenders. As a team, they're a tremendous defensive team, but they can't stop the little guy late in the game from getting to the bucket. Crazy. But then, so that was game one. Exciting finish, bit of an upset. Is not really, as a Heat fan, anything for me to worry about too much. If they were to lose the next game, that might be another story, but opposite of losing the next game. The Heat came in and smacked the Bulls down. It was 115-78, the best playoff win in Miami franchise history and the worst playoff loss in Chicago playoff franchise history.
LeBron James didn't score a single point in the third quarter, and he had complete control of that third quarter. Yeah. Anyone watching that game saw how in control he was. He didn't need to – well, I don't know if he made any points. I know he didn't score a basket.
Right. He came out with a mentality. You could see early on, game one, he wasn't passive, but he wasn't looking to dominate the offense the way he can. Game 2, he came out like a man on a mission, and mission accomplished. When the Heat put their mind to it, when they're engaged, when they're passionate, they can put a hurting on even a good team, even a great defensive team like the Chicago Bulls. In addition to the kind of up and down nature of these games and the huge blowout. This is a physical series, and that's the way the Chicago Bulls want it. And I think that Miami obviously has to adapt to that, and they have, and they'll continue to do so. But the prevailing sort of common wisdom about LeBron James is get real physical with him, because that's the only way you're going to even slow him down. And they do. They go after him, and in game one, well, let's back it up. Regular season, the Bulls are the ones to snap Miami's 27-game winning streak, and they do it in a very physical game. And LeBron afterwards said, those aren't basketball plays. They were hitting me really hard, blah, blah, blah. He wasn't happy about it. What I saw, especially in game two, was a much more prepared and composed LeBron, ready to take on the physical punishment that they were going to be dishing out. And then when they did wrap him up on a drive to the hole, his teammates came in like they were going to, stick up for him and sort of get a little scrum started against the other team. LeBron stopped him, held his hand out, said, walk away. He kept his cool, and he kept his team's cool, because I think he was expecting to get mauled.
Just for future reference, I would expect to hear a lot about how awesome LeBron James is if you continue to listen to this podcast.
Yes.
I think Sam's in love with the LeBron James.
Yep.
And I think I have been for quite a while.
Yeah. And I frankly feel no shame at all.
No.
If you don't love LeBron James, re-examine your sense of basketball and life. That's just a personal suggestion. You don't have to take it seriously.
You probably should, though.
Let's move on. Golden State, San Antonio. Equally crazy series. Golden State, total underdogs. San Antonio, the definition of a veteran team who has played a gazillion playoff minutes. Popovich, an amazingly composed and tough coach. You don't see San Antonio crack, really. But Golden State, they took it to them in game one. And for most of the game, my sense was Golden State's in charge of this thing.
Golden State's won 7 out of the 8 quarters that they've played at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about point totals, but you knew who was in charge 7 out of 8 of these quarters so far. You had Manu Ginobili even say, like, that game 1 in 1,000 chance. That doesn't happen all that often. They came out in game 2. They just rolled them.
Yeah, San Antonio definitely got rolled in game 2, and what's surprising is that I suspected that they were going to pull what Miami did. They had a somewhat disappointing game 1, come back and establish yourself as the dominant team in this series, and they wouldn't. Golden State, especially Klay Thompson in game 2, really looked like the better team, and it's shocking. Golden State is a young upstart who was an upset to even get to the second round. And now they're making San Antonio look like they can't handle the bright lights of the playoffs.
It's pretty wonderful, actually.
It's
pretty
really
exciting.
It's so exciting, and the young, most exciting player involved, Steph Curry. This kid is crazy. Watching him and Durant share a real sense of, as soon as they bring it down across the half-court line, you think he's going to shoot it the second he feels like it, and it's going to go in. When he gets hot, it's something to see. A ridiculous amount of threes. In the first round against Denver, I was rooting for Denver personally, and boy, you feel those threes most acutely when they are against you, when they are not what you want to happen, and especially in the closeout game. Steph Curry, an insane number of bombs from downtown. Really a superstar emerging.
Absolutely. He didn't make the All-Star team this year.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And people cried about it then, rightly so. There's not another player like him. Broke Ray Allen's 3-point record. I mean, I think that a lot of people were I know I was a little bit of a Steph Curry doubter, because apparently his ankles were made of toothpicks for the first 2.5 seasons that he's played. But now that he's gotten his physical, now that he's healthy, the dude is a dominant force for his small size and baby face. He is a dominant force. All right, this is quickly going on longer than we intended. Memphis OKC, really quick. My impression: this feels like Durant versus 5 guys. Every time Memphis, they beat him down low. They go to a lot of offense through their bigs, but Durant is what keeps OKC in the game with his late game heroics, late game shots. It's what he does.
And you're kind of you feel like OKC can pull this out, right?
I do. Yep, I picked them.
I'm deciding I'm against you in this, and here's why. I don't think that OKC minus Durant is better than Memphis, and I think they would almost have to be if only one person is going to win that game for you. It's like if Miami isn't better than the New York Knicks, sans LeBron James,
right.
At least they still have Dwayne Wade they can go to. They still have, to a lesser extent, Chris Bosh. Chalmers can hit some big shots. Ray Allen, Lord knows, can hit some big shots. Like, they have these people that they can go to. OKC sans Durant, they don't beat Memphis one time out of 10.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Obviously, without Westbrook. If Westbrook were in it, it'd be a totally different conversation. But without Westbrook, Durant is a lone man against 5 Grizzly Bears coming at him. And they go low. Memphis goes low in terms of their offense quite a bit. They run it through Gasol. They run it through Zach Randolph. And that's good strategy for them. That's playing to their strengths. But to me, OKC's got a solid shot because I think that Perkins, while I like Kendrick Perkins, but I recognize the man is quite limited. And the one thing he's good at is having a large body to defend guys down low.
You might be the first person out of Oklahoma to say, I like Kendrick Perkins in probably 3 years.
Yeah, he's not a likable player. I think that's part of why I like him. I don't know. He's constantly grumpy. But I think he can handle. Marc Gasol fairly well down low, and Zach Randolph he can give trouble to as well.
I think you're ignoring Mike Conley.
Yeah.
I think that he showed in the last game that he can come on when he needs to.
Conley's surprising to me how good Conley has been. Very surprising. Impressive though, quite impressive. The final second round game, Indiana versus NYC.
I don't care.
Me either. I'm ready to move on. Indiana is just a little boring. All right, so let's talk about something else. I'd like to talk about the mojo of basketball. And real quick, there's a Pepsi commercial with Kyrie Irving. It's Uncle Drew series, and there's 2 parts out right now. And even though it's a commercial, I still derive a great deal of philosophical meaning from it. And I know that sounds silly, but the first line in the part 2 is the great Bill Russell saying, "This game is about feel."
I remember at my best, there'll be nights when the whole world.
That's it right there. And just before that, Bill Russell says, "This game's about feel." And it sounds like such a simple, small line, but I've really internalized that a great deal when I'm watching and playing basketball. This game is about feel. It's a game of passion. It's a game of emotion, maybe more so than other sports. Obviously, strategy and talent and skill are tremendously important, but there's a reason Nate Robb is Nate Robb. It's because he can tap into the feel of the game. The crowd can fire him up like crazy, and he'll hit an improbable number of shots. Same with Steph Curry. Same with Kevin Durant, LeBron James. The players who can tap into that mojo, that's where true greatness comes from to me.
Side tangent, real quick. Neither you or I are really familiar with soccer, which I know is basically a cardinal sin here in Seattle. Yeah. Does soccer have that? It feels like it does. It feels like the crowd is more involved with soccer than any other sport. There's singing. There's the flow. At the same time, do they really help with those 1 or 2 goals per game? Like you see Nate Robinson go off. You can cheer him down in 20 seconds. Right. He's coming back down the court, and he's shooting again, and the crowd's going crazy. To me, that's like a detriment to soccer a little bit. There's just not enough for the crowd to feel like they have an input.
I'm with you. Goals are so far apart in soccer. They're so they feel like a very rare event, which is why the players and the crowd go so crazy when they do happen. You can't get that momentum, the big mo. You can't keep that from goal to goal the way you can from basket to basket.
Absolutely.
In the game of basketball. All right. Let's say you got a smaller guy defending you and he's fronting you in the post. Well, just quickly pivot to the rim and look for the lob. Let's switch it over to politics. And we're back. Today's pivot, the pivot for today's episode is about George W. Bush, former President George W. Bush, and rebounding. The Washington Post recently produced an article saying that George W. Bush's favorability rating has hit a 7-year high. And this is notable because regardless of what side of the aisle you find yourself on, I think it's pretty safe to say he was not a highly looked upon president during his time, especially as he left office. But now he's rebounding and he's coming back. I think probably a little bit of nostalgia, a little bit of the human tendency to look back at things and say, oh, it wasn't that bad. It could have been worse, is probably at play for keeping George W.'s numbers a little elevated now. And it's like in basketball. After every missed shot, there's a chance for a rebound. So GW is just trying to finish the play. We at the Pivot, we salute that kind of initiative. So let's move on. Third quarter. Austerity. It's a troubling word, a troubling notion across the entire globe, in Europe, in Asia, in America. Austerity is a strategy that governments have been trying to implement in an attempt to spur the economic recovery, to bounce back from the Great Recession of 2008. And austerity, obviously, if you don't know, is the process of cutting government spending, reducing the amount government spend on various programs. Now, there was recently discovered some factual errors in an extremely influential Harvard study by two professors named Reinhardt and Rogoff. Now, this study of theirs said that there was a threshold for government debt, somewhere around 90% of GDP. And above this threshold, if government debt reached this magic threshold, there was going to be severe consequences, severe negative repercussions in the economy. Now, this study was taken seriously by a lot of policymakers, and it was used as a primary source of evidence for the austerity argument. At the time, there were critics, but mostly it seemed to be taken as a very credible study. Only recently, a Harvard undergrad found statistical factual errors in the spreadsheet of this study, and it has led to a extreme discrediting of this study and of the austerity argument in general.
So just to clarify, austerity, some people do use it as an excuse or as a way that might increase, the economy, might spur the economy. A lot, though, of the discussion around austerity is the fact that public spending doesn't need to happen in order to spur the economy. Most deficit hawks, their claim is that maybe austerity doesn't boost the economy itself, but you don't need the public spending that happens in government in order to push the growth. And both you and I read a lot of Krugman. How do you pronounce it?
I typically go Krugman.
Yeah, that's what I do too.
Paul Krugman.
Heard it a couple different ways. Pretty fantastic, very Keynesian, very much against the austerity ideas.
From the beginning.
From the beginning, absolutely. So what happened with this report with the grad students is they tried to duplicate the findings, and they just couldn't. They couldn't get the stats to add up. They couldn't get things, and that's why they started looking at this. Also, it is important to note that Reinhardt and Rogoff, they weren't necessarily claiming causal effects. What they were claiming was a relationship existed between the two, that there was, at this point with debt, there were drastic economic consequences.
Yeah.
So they maintain that now. They've gone back,
Right.
They've tried to fix it, but they'd still maintain that they're not saying necessarily that this causes this. It's just that there's a relationship. The problem, of course, being people see that relationship and say, "Oh, this causes this.
Right.
Let's do some austerity."
Right. And and you're absolutely right. It's important to be accurate in terms of what they claim and what they didn't claim. Unfortunately, these complex economic arguments, like many complex arguments. They really get distilled down, and I think that by the time they start to actually influence policymakers, they are received as a sort of simple, this level of debt will cause this bad consequence in the economy, because most politicians aren't economists. They're having the argument, presented to them by economic advisors and whatnot.
Yeah. It's the same thing we do with news stories. We read a news story, we read the first graph, and we call it good. We say that we know what we're looking at.
Now, this reminds me a lot of something that I think of quite a bit in my spare time. If you're anything like me, you spend a lot of time thinking about demand-side economics. Supply-side economics is something that it's a sort of brand that I've heard about my whole life. Reagan and deregulation and the 80s and supply-side economics. And I've always thought that the sort of trickle-down notion, the mentality behind it, a little bit suspect, but it certainly seemed to take hold of the American political landscape, supply-side economics. It's only in the last few years that I've been thinking to myself, opposite, demand-side economics. Because if you think about the very basic forces of supply and demand, supply will follow demand. It will follow demand to the ends of the earth. Supply will follow demand to the Arctic Circle to set up a convenience store to sell cigarettes to the 10 people who happen to be living there. Supply will follow demand because there's money to be made. It's only natural. Demand will not follow supply. Demand doesn't do what supply says hardly at all. If you've got a billion widgets that you're trying to sell that nobody wants, the demand isn't there. You're not going to be moving those widgets. I think that in my mind, the smart thing is stimulate demand. Supply will follow. Stimulate demand. Demand-side economics.
I agree completely. I think that's a completely valid point, but the problem that you're running into is how do you supply demand? How do you supply demand?
Yeah.
How do you boost demand?
Yeah.
And the answer to that, of course, is something that we as Americans are not very happy with. It's give money to people.
Yes.
Give money especially to the largest population of people, which, of course, is the poor.
Yeah. There's a reason that there are much fewer wealthy people than there are not wealthy people. The concentration of wealth happens in a small group of the population. This transitions us right into our final topic of the fourth quarter, and this is the notion that there is often, in terms of policy and in terms of what governments enact and the measures they take to achieve certain ends, there is a conflict often between what people feel and how they feel about the issue versus what will produce desirable outcomes. This is something I think about a lot to myself. People don't like any number of government programs. They don't feel good to the people when they hear about them. Welfare, food stamps, unemployment, you can go on and on. Sometimes, especially people who don't receive those benefits, they don't like the idea that in some indirect way they are paying for the benefits that they're not going to receive. People don't feel good about these programs, but they produce desirable outcomes. Often, what feels good as a population does not produce what we want in terms of outcomes for our society. Sometimes we have to bite the bullet and stuff our feelings and go with what works.
But we can't do that. We simply can't
do
that. The problem is there's a very famous study out discussing homelessness and the simple fact that if we were to give people enough money to have a home, a one-bedroom apartment, a studio apartment that they could call their own, that they could just sit in every night, no matter what they contribute back to society from that point, it would still cost us less. It would cost us less in emergency bills. It would cost us less in police enforcement. There's so many things. It would save us money. Do you ever think that that could happen in the United States? That we could just say, hey, random homeless guy, here's an apartment for you.
Free of charge.
Free of charge.
Yeah.
And I'm a bleeding heart liberal.
Yep.
I am one of the most liberal people I know, it would drive me a little crazy knowing that I'm paying $900 for an apartment when all I have to do is,
not handle life, fall through the cracks, become homeless, and get a free apartment.
Yeah. And of course, we're talking about people who without mental disabilities and returning vets, and that sort of thing is atrocious that those people are out on the streets. There's no doubt about it.
No argument.
Most people, when they discuss homelessness, as we are now, we're talking about people that, in all likelihood,
Could do better. I'm absolutely with you, and that is what is so, I think, easy to understand about this problem that our society faces is think about a cause like homelessness. You might know what a better solution is, and even though you know that that's a better solution, say free housing for the homeless or something like that, it feels so wrong. I would hate the idea that just because you're homeless you get to have a free apartment, but it will literally cost less money for the city.
It's like the single-payer tax thing. If you're in decent shape, I can imagine looking at someone who's a little bit obese and saying, why am I paying for their health insurance? But in all likelihood, you're doing it anyways.
Yeah.
But then people have to look into studies. They have to actually start reading.
There are numerous examples of this that I can think of. A huge example to me is drugs, and the idea that arresting drug users feels like you're sort of taking care of the problem, doing some good, but the reality is that causes prison overpopulation. It causes the prices of drugs it causes the economics behind selling drugs to be much more appealing. There's a lot of examples where the right thing and what feels good are the exact opposite, and unfortunately, too often, we don't have the political will to do the right thing. We do what feels good, what satisfies our sense of vengeance or punishment or whatever.
Or, and I'm going to pull in just a little bit of sociology,
Nothing wrong with that.
as Durkheim says, like it creates us as an in-group. It creates us and our solidarity. We're good people. We are morally good people because we don't do these things that these people in jails did.
Right.
It's an idea that it reinforces who we are in our society, and that's part of why it makes us feel good.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. One final thing I want to mention is Paul Krugman, who we were speaking about earlier. He talks
is beautiful.
Yeah, he talks about how his austerity, how in his perspective, the austerity argument is driven in part by these feelings of satisfying your sense of justice. There's this notion, particularly on the conservative austerity side, that says America lived in excess for several years during the mid from say 2004 to 2008 or something like that. And these excesses, they must be paid for in penance, and that's what austerity is. We're finally becoming disciplined. We're finally eating our vegetables. We're not just going with the excesses that caused all this mess. And Krugman's point, which I think is very salient, is that's nonsense. This is an economy. This isn't one person or a household. Economies are not subject to excesses and then the penance that must be paid for that, as if you were a person trying to score points with your church. And additionally, the people who are suffering now are not the people who caused the problem. So there's not even a connection between punishment and causation, as well as when you reduce anyone's income, you're reducing another person's expenditure and vice versa. In an economy, my income is your expenditures. Your income is my expenditures. It's all much more connected. If you shut down one, you're going to slowly siphon off the flow to the other. And that's the situation we find ourselves in.
Along the penance line, I kind of wonder how much of it has to do with the fact that the generation that's easily the oldest right now, / dying right now, is the Depression era. We look at those people, we see our great-grandparents or our grandparents, depending on how old you are, we know how they lived, and we feel bad that we live in an era of iPads and iPhones, and I got both of those with me right now, and I have an Apple computer.
Sure.
I feel pretty bad about that.
Yeah, and that's natural, but I think, you got to rise above that base instinct when it comes to economic policy, because economic policy sort of doesn't care how you feel.
Absolutely.
All right, that's it for episode 2 of The Pivot. Thank you all for joining and listening to this riveting discussion of NBA and national political issues. We'll put together another episode and hopefully come at you with more piping hot, fresh content for your little minds to devour. Thanks again for joining us.